with Cliff Chang again, who he and I worked on a Swamp Thing story like almost 20 years ago. It's one of the first things that Cliff ever drew. He was actually an assistant editor at Vertigo at the time, and it took us years where we said we wanted to work together again. And Cliff is a new parent, and he draws young people really well. And so, and we're both from kind of the same era of the late 80s. And it felt like, yeah, the late 80s were suddenly, you could see sort of the seeds of what we're all living through right now were kind of planted back then. And it felt like the 80s were going to be newly relevant to us. But yeah, it was also just, I was fascinated by, this literally happened when I was a kid in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, that just one year all of the paper boys, the newspaper delivery kids, suddenly became girls. And I thought it was interesting that just as this profession was dying, and these were kind of the last of their breed, these sort of badass young women sort of came in and claimed this role, and they would go out at 4 o'clock in the morning to deliver bad news to grown-ups, and it was, you know, and then have to go and like shake them down, knocking door to door to get money. It was just, I was so in awe of them, and I thought they were interesting, and yeah, I wanted to write about them.
And in terms of your relationship with Cliff on a book like that, is it similar to your relationship with Fiona, the same kind of collaborative working?
Definitely. Yeah, that each arc we will talk about stuff, and yeah, before we started, Cliff just mentioned the Challenger space shuttle disaster, and I'd sort of, it sort of immediately brought back to my mind what that day was like at school watching that, so that sort of became an important part of the first arc. And Cliff is just such a great artist that he had, mentioned before this most recent arc that he's like, oh, I'd like to do kind of fin de siècle, end of a century storytelling with giant robots. And I was like, say no more, we got it. So yeah, this next arc is all about Y2K and the year 2000, and it's got giant robots, and it's pretty badass.
We Stand on Guard, like I said, I just read it recently and really enjoyed it. That has a much more on-the-nose kind of geopolitical bent to it, which seemed, to me, having read your other stuff, like I said, a bit more on the nose. Was that as a reaction to what was happening?
Well, I gotta say, it might feel on the nose now, but when we wrote it, it was like, Hillary Clinton is gonna be president in like a couple months, and this is like a far-out wacky fantasy. I didn't feel like now it's gonna happen. Like this is actually going to happen. So no, at the time, it wasn't so on the nose. It was more about, I happen to be married to a woman who's Canadian, and Pia Guerra, the Why the Last Man artist, is Canadian, and Fiona's Canadian, and Adrian Alfona, who drew Runaways, is Canadian, and I love collaborating with Canadians, and so I sort of, I was like, why is that? And could I turn that on its head and kind of imagine if I hated these people and had to take up arms against them? So, yeah.
I mean, it's